Hey, hello everyone. Thank you for joining today's Tips and Tricks webinar. Today's topic, as you can see, is on the Infinity Portal Identity and Access Management. Please use the Q&A chat if you have any questions. We'll get to those during the webinar. Our presenter today is an SC from Pennsylvania, Michael Ibarra. Michael, what do you have for us today?
All right. Thank you, Robert. And thank you everybody for joining. I'm really excited to show you some of the ways that we can utilize IAM through an external provider like Entra or Okta or Ping Identity. And this is a topic that I think a lot of us probably have some dealings with in our day-to-day work, but maybe we don't necessarily understand all the ins and outs behind the scenes, and even especially how it all works in terms of a day-to-day hands-on approach. So what we're going to do is take a quick look at how this all fits together, some of the common use cases, best practices, ways that we can integrate the Infinity Portal itself with Entra on the Microsoft side. We'll take a look at this inside of a demo, and then we'll take a look at some additional ways that we can implement, drive adoption, and some resources for you to utilize as you're going on in your own environments. So, as we said, please use the Q&A for questions. We're happy to answer whatever you have for us. And with that, we'll dive in. So to start off with, I just want to review some typical use cases for something like this. When you have an organization of really any size at all, you have staff logging in for various tasks, especially on the Infinity Portal. Maybe you have people accessing Harmony email and collaboration. Maybe you've got a team managing SmartOne Cloud or folks that are working inside of the SASE platform. The standard 9 times out of 10 approach for a lot of folks is to create an individual user account for every single admin that needs it. Maybe they have different roles. Maybe they've got service specific capabilities, but we end up with a very long list of users. And so, like any scenario, we have pros and cons. Obviously, this is a very low complexity approach. It's easy to start with right out of the gate, and it's really attractive in the short term. But long term, this can become really unwieldy because you have, for example, one or two admins who maybe are the user ownership admins, let alone the primary admin within the Infinity Portal who has the ultimate power to administer users and the account itself. If any one of those admins leave the organization or have a role change, that can really complicate and challenge the onboarding and offboarding procedures that you have in place. Obviously, not having any kind of centralized user repository means that we're limited on what we can see in terms of logging or MFA device management. I recently came across a scenario where a customer had asked me, "Hey, how do I reset an MFA device for a local Infinity Portal account?" And I thought for a moment and I said, "Wow, you know what? Actually, I don't think that you can." And you can't. In fact, you have to delete the account and recreate it in order to reset the MFA device. And again, this is talking about local accounts, not third party hosted. So, not really a great solution in that case. Obviously, things like auditing processes and policies like onboarding and offboarding can really be, again, very challenging. So, what ends up happening over time is you have a scenario that looks a lot like this. Obviously, I've anonymized a lot of data here, but this is from one of my test accounts that has obviously lots of different users and activity and various sorts of login activity. And I myself am obviously one of them. You can see right there in the middle. Again, the challenge of intelligently and managing these at scale becomes really tricky. So what do we propose? Well, since this is tips and tricks, we're talking about best practices. So the option that I'm going to be covering today is using what's called an identity provider or an IDP. If you haven't heard that term before, an IDP is essentially a third-party user directory used for identity, authentication, and essentially access control. There are a lot of providers out there, but a list of some of those that we support are listed here. Most common ones that you'll find in a lot of environments are Okta, OneLogin, Duo Security, for example, Entra, of course, ADFS, even if you're using an on-premise Active Directory environment. You'll also notice that we can support pretty much any SAML or Radius-based standardized systems out there. So the list goes way beyond just these ones that we see here. The basic idea behind this is that we're using a third-party trusted provider with user objects that we then trust ourselves. The Infinity Portal and the identity provider have a trust relationship established, which means that the IDP, or the identity provider, handles that authentication itself for the user. It then hands that authorization step off to the Infinity portal based on things like group membership, assigned roles, and ultimately the users themselves. So obviously there are pros and cons with this scenario as well. And we're solving many of the cons we saw in the one-off local user account approach previously. One of the major advantages is, in fact, encouraging user adoption. If you're already using something like Microsoft Authenticator for existing SAML integrations, your users are going to be familiar with this. They're going to have Microsoft Authenticator on their devices, and it's not going to be a huge lift and shift for them to adopt yet another service within the context of something they're already familiar with. We can also pre-populate users via skin, which is a great feature for very large user directories. The downsides, of course, is that this does take more work. This is not a shoot from the hip 5-minute deployment that we drop the mic on after leaving the podium, as it were. For instance, there can be a risk of misconfiguration, either through overly permissive privileges or maybe broken access altogether if you roll this out. With any kind of IDP environment, it's really critical to have some sort of fallback method as well that mitigates the idea of platform lockout. For instance, if your IDP is down or you've misconfigured something, then the benefits gained by implementing this clearly go out the window if you can't even get into the environment. So we need to account for those things and make sure that we have a balance of benefits, risks, and an appropriate testing scenario in place as we go through these steps. I wanted to also share this image from Microsoft's documentation, as I think it's a really helpful diagram to explain what's happening behind the scenes when a user logs in. So I'm going to grab my laser pointer for a moment and just highlight some of these areas. So assume for a moment that you're the user. You're trying to access the Infinity portal, which is this application icon here, and your users are stored inside of Microsoft Entra. So what happens? Well, we go to the provider, which is the application. We put in our username at the portal login step, and the provider says, okay, I see that you're trying to log in. I see that I have an integration configured via SAML. I'm going to send that to my third-party provider, which is the identity provider itself. So the user request is sent over here to the Entra side of the house, and Entra says, all right, fine, let's take a look at what this user is, who they are, what is their group membership, what authentication device types can we use, how do we trust that they are who they say they are. If all of that passes in this fourth step, Entra posts that SAML response back to the application here in step 5. The application receives that and says, all right, I see I have my session token that's been provided by Entra. I am now cleared to authenticate and allow that user to log in, which is what happens here in step 7. So it's a really delicate dance between these two different entities. And this all happens in, gosh, milliseconds usually within the context of a communication stream. Obviously, lots of behind the scenes activity for any of us that are here and using the Infinity portal daily, but really for any SAML-based authentication process, a lot of these same steps, indeed all of the same steps, apply as well. So looking more closely at what we would need to do when integrating the Infinity portal with an IDP, Entra, in our example today, gives us these steps that you would follow. So again, we're looking at a demo today that's going to be looking between Infinity portal and Entra. If you have a different IDP, that's totally okay. We can follow along in many of the same ways, but I want to show you the steps that we would follow in this case. If you spent any time inside of Microsoft 365 or what used to be called Azure AD, this probably seems very familiar to you. First, we're going to create a new enterprise application using configuration items provided by the Infinity portal. Once we have that in place, we create a new group with members inside Entra as well. This can be a group that corresponds to something like a full admin role, read-only access, or maybe some other group that has custom privileges and roles set. These can also be groups that you already have defined. They don't have to be brand new, as long as they are in Entra and they have members assigned to them. Next, we add that group itself to the enterprise application so that it's a candidate for use when we are authenticating the user. Entra groups have a very specific group ID. It's a lengthy alphanumeric string similar to a GUID or a UUID. We provide that specific string within the Infinity portal when we create a new group, and we use that group ID inside of a field called the IDP group ID, which we're going to see up close here in just a moment. Excuse me. After we do these steps, we then assign a role to that group inside of the Infinity portal. This ensures that authenticated users themselves who are members of this group receive that exact role. The very last few steps are finalizing that new IDP integration within the Infinity portal and leveraging that existing configuration to bring things home. And really from that point, we are completely ready to test. So I know the first time I did this, it seemed like a really monumental amount of work to go through and try to make sense of, but thankfully it's not all that complicated. And if you plan it out properly, put things in place where they need to be, and you have an adequate testing plan, this is something that is not enormously difficult or complicated. I wanted to also cover a few additional options that are available within the Infinity portal, but maybe options that not everyone uses off the bat. Not only can we implement an IDP session for SSO, but we can also enforce things like session lifetime timers or a forced reauthentication after so many days or hours. For example, maybe you're logged out automatically after so many hours or a period of time has traversed. Likewise, you're forced to reauthenticate after a period of time. We can also use two-factor auth via SMS or using temporary one-time passcodes with an authenticator app. That's common if you use the Infinity portal. You're probably prompted to set that up anyway on first login. We can also enforce what's considered SSO-only logins. And that means that I can disable effectively local account logins if I have an IDP configured. However, I want to stress that this setting is active for every account except the primary admin. Remember, inside the Infinity portal, you've got that primary admin account. Usually that's the account that created the Infinity portal tenant itself. That account is by nature a local account, and this does not apply to that. And the reason for this is this gives us a fallback login method in the event that our IDP is unavailable or we don't have any other local accounts to use for logins. The other thing we can use here is to restrict access from certain IP addresses or CIDR ranges. And this is a great use case for leveraging something like Harmony SASE to enforce zero trust authentication from a trusted public IP address that we own and operate. For example, suppose you want to only permit logins to the Infinity portal if users are connected to the Harmony SASE cloud. And if they're connected to that Harmony SASE cloud and they're tunneling everything through it, that means that their exit point is going to be a very specific IP address that you own and operate from within Harmony SASE itself. By applying a restricted access clause to that IP address, you're essentially saying you may not authenticate to the Infinity portal unless you are connected to SASE, which means you've already passed device posture checks, maybe even a SAML integration within SASE. And at this point, you really have a powerful zero trust practice in place. So the goal here with any sort of IAM discipline is protecting our management plane, as it were. That management console is frankly the lifeblood and the brains of any SaaS platform. And if it's compromised, it's obviously a very, very bad day. So that is what we're trying to obviously mitigate. All right, that is the end of the slides. So enough of that. Let's get on to our demo, which I'm going to pull up here in just a moment. Screen. All right, so here we are in the Infinity pool. And there's lots of different ways to run through this and show you the under the hood steps and all the different components. I find that it's oftentimes interesting to just jump right in and log in as is and see what we get. So I'm going to show you how that integration actually works from a user's perspective. I have a demo tenant that I've set up inside of Entra that I'm going to use to log in with. CPNJ PASEs on Microsoft. So I'm going to enter this user account into my login form. It's going to redirect me to my IDP. So in that diagram, I'm now being sent over to choose an authenticated login account. Notice that because I have a session token here already, it's asking me, hey, do you want to use one of these accounts that you already have listed? The answer is yes, of course. So I'm going to log in like so. And once I'm logged in, I can have a look pretty quickly at what this looks like. So if I go to my users list, I have a list of individual accounts. This bottom one is actually my primary admin. You can see this is a local account. It's not delivered over Entra ID. And what this gives us is some differentiation between all these different areas. What I can also do is take a note here of my identity and access providers. So I currently have Entra ID enabled. I'm using this domain itself specifically. I can test my connectivity from right here and pretty quickly begin using the service as if it's completely rolled out. So let's take a look at how these roles are mapped. So if you remember, looked at this a little bit earlier, notice that my currently logged in user account here has a global role of admin. How does that actually get applied? I didn't really go in and apply this anywhere. I certainly didn't go into Entra and say, okay, give me an admin account. That's what I want to use. So how does that work? Well, if I go to my user groups here, I have a user group called Entra ID-admins. And sure enough, it's got a global role assigned to it called admin. If I open this up, there's a couple of things I want to point out here. I have a group ID, this UUID value that I shared earlier with you. This is what associates this group back to the Entra ID object that already exists there. What I also want to mention is that the user account that I'm logged in with is definitely part of the member. But if I'm not using Skim, this list is only populated after a user's first login. So if you are using Skim, on the other hand, you can pre-populate these, have as many people in here as you want, use nested groups, etc., and on and on and on. So ultimately, the access role that I am granting to this group is indeed admin. But for that to work, I need to match this IDP group ID during that authentication procedure. And we'll show that here shortly. But all right, let's contrast this now with another example, this time using a read-only user. So let me log out and go through the same exercise again. This time I'm going to use a different account entirely. Let's see. Oops. Fresh there. There we go. All right. So read-only test. We're doing it live, nothing pre-recorded. Sometimes things take a little longer than you think. That's all right. That's how you know we're doing it live. All right, so I'm going to use another account. I'm going to again define that account that I typed in, read-only -test. Continue. I do not have the password stored for that, so I'm going to quickly grab that from another window, paste that in, proceed. And here's my MFA push. So again, we're doing this live, so I'm going to grab my code from my Authenticator app and put that in here. Hopefully I've got the right one. And I think that worked. So here we go. Let's see. All right. Yes. And here we are. So you can see I have a disconnected management server there. We'll jump over to our users pane. And again, the idea with this is that we want to see read-only privileges. The idea is limited permissions. Areas are going to be grayed out. Notice that I have a lot of visibility here, but this test connectivity button is grayed out. I can't click that. Looks like I even have an error here. Can't change any of these settings. I can't even see the users or user groups area. So definitely pretty limited. And this is telling me that, hey, sure enough, a lot of the restrictions that you've put in place are applying because I am logging in with that different user account using an entirely different set of role privileges in itself. So with that in mind, let's take a closer look at the back end to see what's configured inside Entra to make this all work. So over here, I have my demo Entra tenant. I'm going to bring up, just want to make sure I'm signed into the right account here. Great. So let me first take you through the user's view. So if you're like most of the customers out there, you've got a long list of users out inside of your synchronized environment. The demo users here that I'm using are, let's see, you know what, I'll just do this. There we go. Okay, so there's this one. And we'll look up the other one, read only as well. Okay, so obviously I have my users here. That's fine. If I open up my groups, I have, as you would expect, 2 different groups. And if I take a look at those, I'm going to take a look at Infinity Portal -admins. So there really should be only one user in here. And sure enough, there's one total member, Emmett Barr, that's me, there I am. And what's important about this is if we take a look at the overview, remember that object ID that I specified earlier in the group? This is the exact string that I would take and insert into that Infinity Portal group. This is what then directs the Infinity Portal to say, all right, let's assign this role to the user because they are referencing this object ID during their login. In the same way, if I go to my group's overview, back to my full list, again, search for this, I have my read-only group. And again, for this one, I've got that specific object ID as well. And for this guy, I've got a group member that, of course, is read-only test. So with this in mind, we've got a basic setup. We've got users, we've got groups, we've got membership applied. Let's take a closer look now at the enterprise application itself. Now, if you were starting from scratch, you would be going up here to new application, going through some steps that we have specified inside of our implementation guide and really running through it that way. But I've already built this, obviously, so I'm going to show you what this looks like up close. So a couple of things I want to point out here. The most important area you're probably going to be spending most of your time in is under single sign-on. And this is the area where all these threads really come together. The identifier, the entity ID, excuse me, the reply URL, the relay state, these values are actually supplied by the Infinity Portal when I perform my login, or I'm sorry, my integration request with the Entra environment. So in fact, let me go back here and briefly just show you what that looks like. Log out of my test account, jump over here to my, let's actually do this. Okay, again, we're doing this live. Let's try this.
Every time, right?
Yeah, that's right. Hey, we don't pre-record these. These are absolutely live on air. Okay, there we go. All right, so what I was going to show you here is if we go through the steps of creating a new, let's just call this test IDP. I'm going to choose Microsoft Entra ID, of course, and I'm going to unfortunately have to minimize my view a little bit to get to the next screen. You'll notice that I have a couple of different options here as I go through this wizard. And if we keep everything pretty much vanilla here, I'm going to keep all of these settings. I'm going to go to the next screen. I'm going to have to specify a domain, like, I don't know, superfuntimes.com. Sure, why not? I need to prove ownership of that domain by entering a DNS text entry with this value into that domain. Obviously, I don't have that domain ownership, so if I click this, that's going to fail. But on the next screen is where I'm going to gather a lot of these properties that I'm going to then use to insert into the Entra side of the house here. The most important step within this is down towards the bottom, this Federation Metadata XML. This is a packaged set of configuration that includes things like a certificate, a trust establishment, identity information. and really finalizing the integration between the Infinity portal and the Entra environment to be able to say, hey, I trust that Entra is sending me authentication requests that are validated and are going to operate properly. So this is really at the end of the day about kind of the scope of what the settings look like. Again, one of the most important things is setting up those users as groups, making sure that we have our single sign-on panel filled out here. The very last thing that I want to make sure we mention is we have to insert those groups under this view here. If we don't insert those groups, we're not allowing users that authenticate to access this application. So in other words, what we're kind of doing here is saying, look, if you try to access the Infinity portal and you are not a quote unquote member of this enterprise application by being a member of one of these groups, you're not able to proceed through the proper authentication and authorization steps. So regardless of what privileges and roles you're granting your users, you need to have those groups defined here so that you can properly assess those and send them on. All right, to bring things home, we're going to jump back over to this view for a couple more moments. And I'm just going to scroll down a little further and show you a couple of additional options. So we had talked a little bit about session logouts, reauthentication. Those options are here. Force a login after so many days, for example, or even 12 hours. Can we enforce an idle session timeout after 1 hour? Certainly we can. There is another option here that we don't see currently called enforce SSO except primary admin. That checkbox is here if we are logged in with an account that has the primary admin role. So I just want to mention that even though we don't see it, there is that enforce SSO login. But again, caution, this can lock you out if primary admin access isn't preserved. Additionally, we can define IP address or CIDR range restrictions. Again, sort of bringing that zero trust SASE approach into the mix. So lots of different areas that we can further really kind of validate and improve within our existing structure that we have laid out. The other thing we can do here within an existing integration, we can always test connectivity. And at a glance here, we'll run through that. And I would imagine this is going to pass with flying colors because we've been logging in and out. And there it is. So we see that the Infinity portal has properly accessed Entra and vice versa, and everything is looking good. So that is the session that I had for you today. Really from, again, login experience to configuration behind the scenes. Hopefully the key takeaways for you today are those group-based role mappings, SAML federation via Entra, and some of those security best practices that you can really apply. So Rob, I'll leave it to you to take a look at the Q&A and let me know what we need to respond to.
Yep, yeah, we got some questions for you. Somebody asked what identity providers are supported. I mean, there's a pretty good list. We can send you the link to the
Yep.
Infinity.
Yep, there is a list. The out of the box providers, I can just show you real briefly here, kind of if I create a new integration, let me share my screen real quick. This is the basic list here. So you can see those, ADFS, Entra, Okta, lots of the big ones, Google Workspace. But again, if you have a SAML compatible IDP or Radius, you can pretty much do anything you can imagine. There are really no limits because SAML is a standardized framework, as it were. We can support a lot of different third parties. Great question.
Can you configure multiple identity providers?
You can. Yep. You can add, I mean, I already have one configured here. You can certainly click the plus sign, go through the wizard, add another one. I'm not aware of a limit to how many you can add.
I think the limit's 5, but we can buy that.
Okay. Yeah, that very well may be. Yep.
Let me see. A couple of these were answered. Token. Are there regional limitations?
In terms of data governance, privacy, that's a good question. I don't believe that there would be from the Infinity portal perspective. Obviously, the Infinity portals can be created based on regions around the world globally. Since it is a SaaS platform, we host them in various locations. I would think at that point, then you're looking at data governance, privacy, where's the data located, where are the processors, who want to be custodians for that data, how does that really influence your data privacy strategy as an organization? Maybe that's not quite what your question was, but I don't know of any from an Infinity Portal perspective, but I think in terms of like governance, compliance, regulations, that might be an area to take a look at within the regions that we have available from a checkpoint perspective.
Somebody asked for setup instructions. I believe that's all listed out in the Infinity Portal Admin Guide.
Yes, it is. Yep.
Yep.
At the very end, I think there's a section on identity provider integrations. Yep.
Yep, I can send
100%.
that with the follow-up also. Got, I guess, comments more than questions. Maybe you can add to it. Oscar said, SSO works fantastic. I create a break glass admin with this feature.
Mhm.
And
Yep.
he said it also works great with Google Workspace accounts.
Perfect. Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. So even
Thank-
Oscar's using a lot of alternate providers that clearly work well. So that's great to hear.
Yeah. Anything else? Send it over. We're right at time here. Let's see. Place. Yep, that covers it. Oh, geofencing. You answered that, right?
Right. So yeah, restricting access to a specific address, site or range. Yeah, definitely something worth taking a look at, especially if you have a very strict compliance standard you're adhering to. Yeah, can absolutely do that.
Perfect. All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you, Michael. Great information.
Yeah,
We'll
thank
send
you.
up that follow-up email with the reference content and the recording link. Our next webinar will be in 2 weeks. You'll see the invitation for that soon. So thanks for joining, and we'll see you here next time. Enjoy your day. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Bye all.